people listening, they are familiar with outcomes over outputs most likely. But there's this idea, especially Tim Herbig has been one of the ones pushing this idea the most, I think. This idea that yes, key results should be outcomes, but not at all costs. That's kind of what he argues. And sometimes it's okay to have output-based key results. What's your take on that, Christina?
Oh, I am very rigorous here. I think it should always be outcomes. And if you can't tell me why you're doing that output, I don't think you should do it. That's the thing, is every time we come up with a project, right, there's got to be a reason why. Like, what does success look like? If we did this project, what changes? And if you ask that question, if we did this project, what changes? The answer is probably your key result. We get more customers. Our customers are happier. We sell more items per customer, whatever. There should be a way to measure everything. And so I come from a design background before I moved to product. And my fellow designers will hate me because they're always like, well, there's this intangible, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, I think there's a way to measure it. We just aren't working hard enough.
Hello there, welcome back. I'm Afonso, and in today's episode, I discussed all things OKRs with the one and only Christina Wodtke, the best-selling author of the book Radical Focus and many others. Christina's book is for many the Bible on OKRs. But should you even use OKRs at all? Do you have the right ingredients in place? What are some of the principles you should aim for? What are some of the challenges teams and leaders face when using OKRs, and what can you do about it? Well, we'll cover all of that and so much more in this conversation. I loved it, Christine is amazing, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. All right, let's dive in. We have spoken so many times on this podcast about how talking frequently with users is so important for product teams. It lets you understand user needs, test your designs, and make sure you're building the right products. But many teams tell me that they can't find time for it in their busy workday because recruiting the right users is too hard. So I want to quickly mention a company I'm advising that can help you with this. UX Signals lets you target users inside your website or app and automatically book interviews into your calendar. So you can put the recruiting on autopilot and just show up for the conversations. Instead of waiting weeks, you can get interviews within a few hours and talk to people while they'll still have the user experience fresh in their minds. It's used by big companies and public organizations like DNB Bank, Vips Mobile Pay, Nav, and many, many more who are building digital products and services with millions of users. I really recommend checking it out on uxsignals.com or by clicking the link in the show notes. Tell them Afonso sent you and you'll get a 50% off your trial. Okay, Christina, we are live. How are you today?
I'm great. It's a beautiful day here in Palo Alto, and I'm really excited to get to spend some time with you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. I'm a big fan, so this is a special moment for me. And let me start by saying something that Felipe Castro said and wrote about you. He mentioned, together with Dor, Groove, and Drucker, Christina Wodtke is one of the 4 people who shaped OKRs into the powerful tool it is today. Your book, Radical Focus, is, or has been, and is one of the #1 Amazon bestseller, is basically the Bible for OKRs, and so I think we have a lot to discuss. And you've been teaching at Stanford for 7 years and a bit more. And there's just so much we could talk about. I mean, even your latest book, Present Yourself, but I really want to dig into OKRs. I hope that's fine with you.
Everybody wants to know more about OKRs. I'm used to it.
Absolutely. All right, so Christina, first question I have is, and let's just get started here on this topic. So many organizations want to adopt OKRs, but the question is, should they? What are the ingredients they have to have in place, and should they, basically?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, people think that OKRs are going to be some kind of silver bullet that will magically fix everything, and they really aren't. I try to tell people that they're not a medicine, they're really more of a vitamin. If your company is healthy and wants to become even more powerful and even healthier, then OKRs are great. OKRs are a way to communicate strategy. So it helps to actually have strategy. And by strategy, I mean you should know what your biggest challenges are. You should know what it takes to win, and you should have a good idea of how you're going to win that marketplace. And then the OKRs can be a way of letting your employees know what the executive team is hoping for and find their way to make it happen. In order to do that, you have to have quite a bit of autonomy. OKRs work best, I think, with multidisciplinary autonomous teams. The kind of teams where you say, hey, should we do something with events? Or what is AI going to mean for us? You know, that's the kind of team you would want to use OKRs with, because then you can say, you can set an OKR around that. So our company realizes the value of AI in its customer service team. And then your key results could be things like, number of messages sent or shorter time to response, or, thinking really about what that's going to be concretely. Which brings me to another requirement. You have to be able to measure. I am always really surprised by how many companies aren't measuring their most important values. And I know there's things, it's really hard sometimes to figure out how to measure some things, but there's always a way if you work harder on it. It might be a little bit sloppy, it might be a little bit goofy, but the practice of measurement teaches you so much that I encourage people not to forget about it. And the last one is psychological safety. A lot of people get psychological safety wrong. They think it's about having a safe space, but it isn't. It just means that you feel comfortable enough with your boss and people who have a different power level to you that you can ask a question, or you can disagree, or you can add your 2 cents in or have an idea. It sounds easy, but a lot of workplaces are really full of fear, which breaks my heart.
Absolutely. So just to recap the things you said, strategy in place, because OKRs is a way to deploy that strategy to teams, and therefore it's a way to create autonomy, but that autonomy needs to be part of the culture already, so that's kind of an ingredient that needs to be part already of the organization, otherwise chances are OKRs are not going to work very well. Also the habits of the teams of measuring and inspecting and adapting, that needs to somehow be part of the culture already, and a psychological safety for people to discuss and so on. But a question here, when it comes to the culture and to some of these ingredients, one argument sometimes is, well, can OKRs be sort of a vehicle to foster that culture if we're not there yet? So basically, can OKRs help us bring these ingredients to the table in a way, or do they have to exist already?
Well, there's the ideal and there's the reality. In the ideal world, you had all those things, right? But the reality is very often people don't. And I feel a little naughty saying this, but the cadence that goes with the OKR methodology fixes things all by itself. It doesn't fix everything, but it fixes a lot. For example, every Monday saying, hey guys, remember, this is what we're trying to do, and here's some things we're doing towards it, and how are we feeling? Is it going to work or not? That's like huge. That's game changing. Even if you have outputs instead of outcomes, even if you are, don't have psychological safety, just that regular rhythm of saying, hey guys, remember, this is what we're doing. And then the Friday celebrations, I knew a company, I was working with a company, and the first thing they did was Friday celebrations, because they were like in the middle of Q2. And the CEO called me back and he's like, oh my God, it's all the mood in the office is already changed. So you can use parts of OKRs, or even use OKRs sort of out of the box. And some things will get better. That's all. You're just missing out on some of the greatness of OKRs if you don't think about those other factors.
Absolutely. So basically, the fundamentals, as soon as you start using OKRs, even though you're not using them sort of by the book in a way, as long as you get those habits in, that's gonna make an amazing difference. And I really like the point you make on celebration, because usually people forget about celebrating. It's so important to celebrate the small things. So I really enjoy that you're bringing that in. Okay. So I wanted to dive into objectives first, a few questions, and exploring a bit the concept of objectives so that people that are listening understand what great looks like and so on. And then we can dive into key results. Starting with objectives, let's start with the company overall objectives. When an organization decides, okay, guys, let's do OKRs, and we start thinking about company-wide. And what I see sometimes is people going into discipline-based OKRs. So marketing has their own OKRs, and sales have their own OKRs, and product have their own OKRs, and then the CEO gathers all the OKRs. And what are the risks with this approach, Christina?
Well, the obvious one in my case is earlier I said multidisciplinary teams do well with OKRs. These are not multidisciplinary teams; they're single discipline teams. And the thing is, marketing can only do so much. They can sell it, but how are they going to deliver a product, right? Design can make some beautiful mock-ups, but they're not going to actually be interactive without engineering. So you really need the kind of teams that will create value for the customer. And that's the mindset you need to have. And so what the OKRs are doing is trying to figure out what kind of value is being delivered, what kind of value is being captured by the business back. And so if your job is not directly part of that value chain, you're going to have to partner with other people. And it's as simple as that. And it's very frustrating. There is an exception. I'm the queen of exceptions. Sometimes a team will get big enough. Trust me, everything, all rules have exceptions. If a team gets big enough, like engineering gets big enough, it has a dedicated ops team or a dedicated team maybe working on code health, or design has design ops, some dedicated people work only on styles, guides. They're independent enough they can use OKRs if they choose to. But every time you add more OKRs, you're increasing the complexity and making it harder for people to remember what the most important thing is. If you're trying to remember 20 most important things, then you don't have a most important thing.
Exactly. I think this can be, I totally agree. And at the same time, I think it can be a challenging concept to grasp from a few CEOs, for example, because they say, well, what do you mean? Like, do I just have objectives for the teams? I want 10 objectives for the company, and then that cascades down and all of that talk that I'm sure you've heard about before. So what helps to help them change this mindset of assigning objectives to multidisciplinary teams instead of having this massive cascade of OKRs that we all know it doesn't really work?
It's very
what
messy
helps
and
them
very
to change
tight.
that mindset?
Yeah. Well, I think you said something that was really important, which was they assign OKRs. And if you're assigning OKRs instead of the teams coming up with their own OKRs, then you run the risk that we saw with Wells Fargo and VW. So the VW story, of course, is when they were assigned a literally impossible car design. And when that happened, they cheated because they had to. That's the only way they could get their bonuses. With Wells Fargo, they said every single person must have like 14 products. Like, what would I do with 14 products? I can't even imagine. And again, people cheated because they had to. So only the team knows what they're capable of. So asking the team to do it is great. But you're going to say to me, Christina, what if they're are lazy or are sandbagging? Well, hopefully, if you have strong management skills, and I cannot emphasize too hard that people who are managers should get training to be managers. So if you've got good managers, they'll say, well, but what if everything went right? What would that number look like? Just kind of nudge them gently towards a little stretchier goal. When I first started, I'd worked at all these, really hardcore companies, Zynga and MySpace and LinkedIn. And so I was used to always aiming for a moonshot, the way Google talks about it. But as I started working with more and more companies, I realized they often don't have psychological safety, at which point it becomes very dangerous to shoot for the moon. And then I started talking about yoga stretches. So it's a stretch goal, but it's just a little one. When you take yoga, they say stretch, but if it starts to hurt, back up a little bit, right? And so it's the same thing. You want to get people to gently push their goals a little bit harder, and then the next quarter a little bit harder, and the next quarter a little bit more, until you start saying, okay, that feels about right for us. and you'll get more flexible.
Absolutely. All right, so let's dig into this a bit because, for example, Marty Kagan talks about assigning objectives to teams and then allowing the teams to work on the key results, basically. Do you agree with that? Yeah, okay. So basically assigning problems to solve. So basically leadership focusing on the themes or kind of the overall outcomes and then having that negotiation with the team. Is that how you see some of what you would consider great teams working, or are they doing differently?
Most of the great teams, the really best teams, will come up with both, and then it will be okayed by peers or their manager, somewhat like that. Just if you think of it less as improving and more like a sanity check, then it makes sense. I see why Marty thinks about assigning objectives and then letting people come up with their own key results. Key results is where it often goes wrong, because until you've been measuring numbers for a long time, it's really hard to know what those numbers are even going to be. But I think that the team should be able to say, actually, we think this is the right thing to work on right now. And you can see why that psychological safety is important, because you have to be brave enough to say, I know, boss, you said this, but we're here on the ground level. We see it every day. We think it should be that. And then be able to have that kind of conversation about which is better. So I wouldn't be too fussy about it, saying it absolutely has to come from the boss or it absolutely has to come from the team. But I would say work hard to create a space where that conversation can happen.
All right, and that to me sounds good. So let's say you have a product leader. The product leader comes in with a draft or of an objective. Has a negotiation with the teams. Of course, if the team is senior enough, they can come up with both, like you said, both the objective and the key results. And there's a conversation going on. There's enough psychological safety for people to have an intense debate and all of that stuff. But when it comes to company overall objectives, so for example, imagine you're a CEO of a scale-up and you want to set some direction for the company that would basically cater for a lot of different people. Do you usually recommend those objectives to be actual OKRs, so objectives and key results, or just broad objectives, and then it's up to the different teams that are composed by product, design, engineering, marketing, and so on, to figure out how to get there?
So this has a lot to do with company size. I mean, if you're a really small company, you know, a baby startup that just started, your only objective is get the product market fit. That's your objective. But how you shape the key results will tell you if you get to product market fit. So it's very useful to use OKRs at that size. And then if you're a little bit bigger and you're starting to get scaling going, you can totally use OKRs all day long. It'll be terrific. It's when you start getting big enough that you have different business units, especially if your business units are very disparate, like Google with its self-driving cars and its search and all that. That's the point where it's really rare to have a company level objective or OKR set. Every once in a while, there's a moment, though, that happens. I'd say moments I can think of is digital transformation, the moment that tons of companies suddenly had to figure out what the internet meant, or COVID, that's a company level objective, or now AI. Like that's a big question. The companies now have to say, it's because it's going to touch everything. Otherwise, I think business unit is about the right level. If you get to a level where everybody's working on the same business, that's a great place to set OKRs. I actually am agnostic on whether to do the whole OKRs or just objectives. I love measuring. I find that measuring makes the objective clear, less fluffy. So I would lean towards having the full set, but if people made a good argument, otherwise I'd love to hear it.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially what you said about the figuring out at what level is enough to have that cluster of direction, basically, and then allowing the teams to figure out how to go in that direction. And there might be teams that will not be working on things that will be directly linked to that objective, and that's fine, as long as we are making space for some teams to be driving those important outcomes. And so when it comes to shared objectives, it's something I would like to discuss a little bit with you. This idea of we have a product team, a cross-functional product team that all of a sudden needs to collaborate intensely with other team, and maybe marketing and sales as well. Do they share the same objective? What are some of the techniques that you've seen working the best in those cases, or what should be mindful?
You said it. I mean, sharing an objective, that's one of the wonderful things about OKRs, is that it makes it clear that we're all working on the same thing. We're all looking for the same results. We can argue about how we're going to make it happen. We can differentiate depending on the skills that we bring to the puzzle, but sharing an OKR is a way of getting everybody pointed in the same direction, and everybody knows what success looks like. So I think I hear this all the time. It's like, how do I get people to do this thing I want? How do I get people to do this? And everybody thinks it's going to be like a magical, like, here's my wand, boom, now everybody will obey you. Especially product people who have all the authority or all the responsibility and none of the authority. It's a tough one.
Yeah.
You have to figure out how to communicate. I teach product management in the fall at Stanford, and it's 1/3 communication skills, because it's so vital to go around, talk to each person, figure out what their issues are, get them online. Bruce McCarthy and Melissa Appel have a new book out called Aligned that I would definitely recommend people take a look at, because without communication skills, you can't do anything, and there is no magic wand to make people agree with you.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. I was honored to review Bruce's book. It's a fantastic book, and we had him on the podcast 2 times already.
So people should go back and listen to that, right?
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk a little bit about key results. So people listening, they are familiar with outcomes over outputs most likely, but there's this idea, especially Tim Herbig has been one of the ones pushing this idea the most, I think. This idea that yes, key results should be outcomes, but not at all costs. That's kind of what he argues. And sometimes it's okay to have output-based key results. What's your take on that, Christina?
Oh, I am very rigorous here. I think it should always be outcomes. And if you can't tell me why you're doing that output, I don't think you should do it. That's the thing, is every time we come up with a project, right, there's got to be a reason why. Like, what does success look like? If we did this project, what changes? And if you ask that question, if we did this project, what changes? The answer is probably your key result. We get more customers. Our customers are happier. We sell more items per customer, whatever. There should be a way to measure everything. And so I come from a design background before I moved to product. And my fellow designers will hate me because they're always like, well, there's this intangible, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, I think there's a way to measure it. We just aren't working hard enough. Right.
That's such a nice point, because I think it was, I can't remember right now, but I think Lenny had, I think it was Figma CPO, can't remember his name now. Yeah, and he talked about that. He talked about the fact that sometimes, that there was him saying that he felt that sometimes some key results would be very difficult to measure because they need to be kind of subjective and I'm not quite sure what he said exactly, but it was along those lines.
But it's okay to say it's kind of subjective, because then we could ask who is it subjective to? So I actually think that you can have a metric that's binary. It's a yes/no one. It's not very often, but let's say you're working in early stages on a big project, and later when it's launched, it's going to hopefully change customer behavior. But right now, it's not going to. But maybe you have to get it approved by the product council, if you have a product council. That's going to be a yes/no. It's hard to do. You can't just do it. It's actually a terrific key result. Be approved by the CEO, or pass, get a certain approval rating from early customers. Just dig a little deeper and ask yourself, what does good look like? And if you can measure what good looks like, I don't care if it's a yes/no question or a 70% question, because I use confidence instead of progress. That can change every week.
Very good. I think this outputs versus outcomes. When I'm talking about this, where I get the most resistance is, for example, from engineering when they say, yeah, but we know that we just need to integrate with this platform, or we know that we just need to get this migration going. And I really like what you said. Yeah, but there's a reason why we're doing that, and
Yeah.
so let's get to that why, and let's try to measure whether we are moving the needle in the right direction. But apart from asking why, is there any other mental model that you sometimes use for people to grasp the importance of this idea, or you just use the why technique?
Yeah. One of the most wonderful moments. So I'm a mom, and I remember when my little kid was, at that age where all they say is why, why. First they say no a lot, then they move to why. And then one day we're at a nice restaurant, and my 6-year-old, I think she was then, she puts this fancy folded napkin on top of her head. And I'm like, that's not a hat, put it down. And she goes, how do you know? And that's the phrase I love, is how do you know? So
I love
if
that.
the engineering team's saying we absolutely have to integrate this, I would say, okay, let's pretend you've integrated it. How would you know if it was successful? How would you know? What would change? So why is
Right.
good? How do you know is good? What does success look like is good? Because we rarely want to do something and just go, there, I did it. Well, maybe in life, washing dishes. But in a business, you're always trying to have some end result that's positive for the business. And if you can't say why, I think you shouldn't do it.
Absolutely. Very good point. Okay, so then something that is very helpful is, of course, when we get to the why, is to connect some tasks or priorities of the week, like you've described before. So, is that how you, in an ideal world, would want teams to work? So you have the objective, you have the measures of progress, so the key results, the outcomes that we want to measure. And do you recommend teams for every week? There's this discussion on, okay, what are we going to do? What are the initiatives to measure, to move the needle, basically? Is that how you work, on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis?
It depends on the company. Weekly is my favorite because we already have this natural weekly cadence of our lives, right? We all have the weekend off. We come in on Monday, Friday we leave. So there's a concept called temporal landmarks, and it just means there are certain times that people think of as moments of change. So, for example, New Year's is a temporal landmark because you stop and go, okay, what's my resolution? What do I want to do differently? Or your birthday is a temporal landmark. Mondays and Fridays are temporal landmarks, and so are quarters. That's why I have OKRs quarterly, because it's already suited to the natural rhythm of the company. So I like every week. If you don't have something to say every week, it's okay. You can say no change and move on. In a dream world, you get so that your OKR Monday check-in is like 20, 30 minutes. Why not, right? But if there is something we're saying, then you want to make sure you make the space to have that conversation. I think because our calendars have half hours and 1 hours, we make every single meeting fit into it. I would say schedule a Monday meeting for an hour and then try to get it over in 15 minutes if you can get away with it, because people love to have their time back. So yes, the cadence is absolutely critical. But if the company has a 6-month cadence, run with that. If the new year starts in August, which a bunch of companies do, which I find very strange, but okay, or July, go with that. Try to make sure the OKRs are the rituals are working along with the natural rhythm of the company.
Very good. And how far do you only plan for that week, or because usually one of the sort of not counter arguments, but one of the friction is that but we need to plan so much more ahead on what exactly we're going to do. So how do you approach that? It depends a lot, but do you recommend people to strictly just look at 1 week ahead, or are you okay being flexible?
Oh, I'm very flexible on this because sometimes things take longer than a week to build. I mean, it's not like everything can only take 1 week. We're talking about this week, what's moving forward. but we should also have some sort of a view into what's coming up further ahead. So in Radical Focus, I had a really simple template called brilliantly the Foursquare. I should have given a good name. And that has, what's happening this week, but it also has a month-long lookout. And that time horizon, again, it'd be very much what suits your company. I know people who do a lot of R&D often have much longer horizons. But that said, you still want to be measuring the quality of what this job is having to do. So I'm a lean startup girl. I met Eric Ries when he was giving his first talks on the lean startup and followed it all very closely. And one of the core concepts in lean startup is, of course, reducing risk through running small experiments, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about that with OKRs, you're going to do a big project, but how can you reduce the risk of a big project? You're going to give 6 months of a big bunch of your team to do something that you don't know if it's going to work or not. That just terrifies me. So going through and figuring out what are the milestones, not delivery milestones, but experience milestones. Where could they land? So when you have a concept, is there a way to test the concept with your end customers? When you have a first design, is there a way to test that with your customers? Finding these moments along the way where we can ask, are we pointed in the right direction, is incredibly valuable. And that's the sort of thing that fits very nicely into the OKRs.
Absolutely. And you do have this concept of exploratory OKRs and milestone OKRs as well. So I guess when you are certain of, okay, let's take this example. You have defined a few outcomes that you want to achieve, and you're pretty certain that those are the right outcomes you should focus on. You have done a few experiments, you have all the initiatives, and you have a grasp of the sort of the longer term plan of a few things you want to do. But sometimes you don't really know yet what the outcomes should be, and you don't really know yet basically where you should focus on. Is that a time where we should use exploratory OKRs? And if so, what are those, Christina?
Well, exploratory OKRs are, we don't really know what we're making, but we know what the result's going to be. So let's go back to our beloved little startup example, right? Their objective is get product market fit. That is really vague. That's insanely vague. But we should know what are the signs that would tell us that we hit it. So it could be number of customers adopting the platform, or number of customers in a concierge experiment, or how many paid customers do we have? Thinking about Steve Blank's early evangelist, we should figure out what those signs are, because one of the biggest problems with startups, and I'm in the Silicon Valley, I work with startups all the time, is that they get a little long in the tooth. They're on their Series D round, and they still aren't real. They sort of have some good signs, but they're not quite good enough. Do we kill the company? Do we not kill the company? By having really good, strong numbers that you say, if we don't make this, we have to either pivot or perish. And if we get those numbers, we'll persevere. The famous 3 Ps of startups. It makes such a difference. I had a startup, and I just could not tell whether I should keep going with it or not. And I went out and drove out and met Steve Blank and talked to him for 2 hours. And afterwards I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go ahead and sell it, and shopped it around and sold it to LinkedIn. Nice. We can't always drive over to Steve Blank's place, so we can't always stalk somebody if they're in another country. So then the question is, how are we going to decide our own go, no go, right? And I love exit criteria. I love go, no go signs, because they take the pressure off of that sort of murky confusion. So exploratory OKRs are just that. It's like, we don't know what the fuck we're doing, but here's some numbers, and if we move those numbers, we can keep going.
I love that. And I think that must come with a few caveats sometimes. For example, let's take this scenario where always, right? But let's take this scenario where you say, okay, if we get 5 letters of intent, we persevere, right? But then again, I guess this is the moment where we are agreeing on what we want to achieve, but let's agree on maybe some rules or some principles that we want to follow to get to that place, such as we're not going to radically reduce the price just to get those letters of intent, because we need to have a viable business. So all of these conversations need to happen in parallel, I would say. Do you agree, or do you see it differently?
Oh my gosh, of course I agree. Because but sometimes I think everybody's trying not to have to have a conversation, and the conversation is everything. The conversation is incredibly important. So yeah, let's say you did have to reduce the price to get letters of intent. That just told you something incredibly important about your company, which is your business model is not going to make sense. Or maybe you have to really focus on reducing the cost of creating the product so that you can get what you get. This is all information. I think a lot of people spend too much time thinking about how do I get my OKRs right, when they don't realize that getting your OKRs wrong is an opportunity to learn and make a stronger company out of that learning.
That is so beautifully said. Thank you.
Thank
you. That's really, 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 really good. All right. So, since we're talking about startups, and since you've worked with so many startups, Christina, what are some of the main pitfalls that startups do when it comes to goal setting? Usually that you've seen.
Honestly, I think startups are the easy ones. Like I find that startups do extraordinarily well with OKRs because they're usually, I would love it if all startups started with a market, but they don't. They start with an idea. They're like, what if you can draw inside of email, or so they already have an idea. And so then the OKRs makes them really ask, wait a second, why would this make a difference in people's lives? What would change because of the rigorousness of the OKR? So it's really helpful for startups. It works really well with game studios, I think, also, which may sound strange. But if you think about it, the game has one job, which is to be fun enough that people will pay for it. And that's very easy to measure as well. And so that's another place where it's simple. Where it gets messy, where it gets really hard, is those big companies where there's cross dependencies. If somebody in a team is working on 5 different projects, your OKRs are probably not going to work for you unless they're at least the company level, because people are torn in too many different directions. Yeah. I used to think that there had to be a way for OKRs to work well with those big companies, but I've actually come to the point where I'm like, you're just going to make yourself crazy. It's like teaching a pig to sing. You waste your time and you annoy the pig. So, so I think if you have a really big company with lots of cross dependencies, unless you're willing to do a giant ass reorg where you turn everybody into little tiny mini companies, forget about it. Just skip it. Skip it.
That's such an important point, Christina, because so I love this book, Team Topologies by Manuel Pais and Matthew.
Oh yeah.
It's so. Needless to say, team topologies are incredibly important to ensure that everybody is working towards a value stream. And of course, we know that what actually happens in big corporations is that it's a massive Tetris. Like there's so many cross dependencies, and like you're saying. And then, even though there's a strategy, back to those ingredients we talked about in the beginning. Even though there's a strategy, even though people may think that there's psychological safety and so on and so forth, the design of the organization itself doesn't really enable them to pursue certain outcomes, and the interdependencies are so big that the number of shared OKRs and the number of teams sharing that OKR is so big that maybe it doesn't work.
Yep.
Yeah.
You said it well. There's a place where it's not going to work. I think between you, me, and the wall, because I have a day job, I don't have to worry about making my clients angry when I do little consulting gigs. So I actually am in a place where I can say, no, don't, it's not going to work for you. It might work in multidisciplinary team levels, but once you get into those cross dependencies, it's not going to work. And I know we would love it to align people, but they can only stretch so far before they break. There's a point where having 3 teams, marketing, product, customer service, all working towards the same OKR, that's terrific. But when it's this marketing and that marketing and CrossFit, I'm working on this, and it's untidy, and it's confusing. It's just confusing. That's why I'm a radical focus girl, because I'm such a fan of like, this is the single most important thing, because that level of clarity increases your likelihood of success.
Absolutely. And in that case, of course, if it's chaos, I guess just so that it's clear for people listening, some of the signs that you are in a organizational design that is not particularly enabling this to work is the number of interdependencies. If your shared OKRs are shared with 20 teams, if that is the case, you're probably in a bad place, and you are in a better. If I understood you correctly, Christina, you're in a better place to looking into your team topologies and redesigning your organization towards value streams, for example, instead of trying to scale OKRs towards all of these Tetris, basically. Is that?
I think that would just make you crazy. Yes, very much so. I think you just have to remember that OKRs work for multidisciplinary people who are working towards a shared goal that have control over their own resources. And it's that control over your own resources that makes it so important.
Very good. All right, a question. I usually tend to ask this to other people as well. It's a question that I love. Since you've wrote Radical Focus, the second edition, is there anything you've changed your mind on throughout the years?
Oh gosh. It's funny because on LinkedIn somebody was complaining that I backed away from cascading, and I'm like, I didn't back away from it. I got new information, because cascading works terrific for startups, right? There's only 3 levels of the cascade. It's pretty easy, There's a company level, there's a team level, maybe there's only 2 levels actually. But if you try to cascade in a big company, we're talking 15 levels of cascading. So I was told a story by a former Yahoo employee about when Marissa Mayer first became CEO of Yahoo. And she decided, she put in something that wasn't called OKRs, but it was OKRs, because, she's Google, so got OKR in the blood. And she demanded that she would review and approve every single director and up level OKR. And it took her a month, because she does have another job, she's CEO and stuff. At which point everybody had to revise their OKRs because they only had 2 months now to do it. It was just a disaster area. So I would be cautious about approvals and cascades. The way I've seen it work best is where everybody has to get 2 peers and their direct manager to look at their OKRs and okay it. So the peers would be the people who you interact with, so they'd know something about it, and the manager too. But you could even skip a manager if you have a really flat hierarchy, because I know places like Google, they have like 46 or 70 people reporting into one manager. Once again, you got to look for those roadblocks, because a process that doesn't stay nimble won't be used. So maybe you just do peer reviews, but that is a certain level of letting go that's hard for some bosses. So I'd say if you're a boss who really wants to micromanage, you really feel like you have to have control over what everybody's doing, don't use OKRs. It's a waste of your time. It annoys the pig.
Right. Very good point again. And I guess like cultural norms also play into this, because more egalitarian cultures, for example in Scandinavia, more flat, less hierarchical, no problem with confrontation and open debate and so on. That's probably a more, like, speaking of cultural norms, probably a more friendly to use OKRs if you are in a culture that is extremely hierarchical, where people avoid debate and things like that. So back to your point on cascading and approvals and avoid approvals, of course a product team working in, for example, a highly hierarchical culture and very top-down way of deciding, that might be a particular challenge.
Yes, I actually, what I think is interesting, I'm really fascinated by culture. So you are going to use OKRs the way you just described it. You're going to like argue and debate and wrestle, fight over it. But if you had, say, a Japanese company who's using OKRs, they will debate, but they'll do it in a very gentle, polite, sort of a more subtle way. It's a high context culture. which means that everybody sort of knows everybody else's point of view. They're very similar, very homogenous. When you get into trouble is when you have mixed cultures coming together, because then, let's say you're part of an international company and you're working with a couple of Japanese colleagues, and you're going, okay, guys, I don't know about this. I don't think this is going to work. And they're going, oh my God, who is this jerk? He's horrible.
Exactly.
No. So in my second book, Team That Managed Itself, I talk a lot about the importance of collectively setting norms and really looking at these these potential cultural clashes, I think, I would say. I'm a big fan of Erin Meyer's book, The Culture Map. Can't recommend it too highly. Yeah. And once you know these places where you can get into trouble, you can go through and have a discussion like, okay, when we disagree, how are we going to disagree? What is the right way? And you can work through it. But I think all companies have a way to disagree. Just a question of, is everybody working in that way?
Absolutely. No, I'm a big fan of the Culture Map book. Fantastic for folks working in big organizations, and like you said, to understand those cultural differences and use it to navigate challenges like these. Any other books, Christina, you would recommend? So maybe some hidden gems that you've read and that kind of changed your your perspective into things related to the topic of our conversation so far.
Well, I think that speaking of the culture map, Erin Meyer had a wonderful, amazing article on corporate culture in the Harvard Business Review. Not this month, but the month before. I recommend it super highly. She talks a lot about the work she's doing with Netflix, which I find Netflix just keeps being a paragon of excellence as a company. And I highly recommend The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. Amy Edmondson's the person who first discovered / named psychological safety. It's a terrific book, like really a good read, enjoyable. I loved it. I think when we talk about strategy, I think strategy is one of the most difficult things to deal with. There's so much out there that's written, and very little of it is super actionable if you're a little tiny company. So a lot of times you'll read it and you're like, when Procter & Gamble was trying to figure out how to enter Peru, they did this, and you're like, nothing to do with me. So I enjoyed The Crux. I think The Crux is quite good. It's by the same guy who wrote Good
No Bad.
Strategy.
Exactly. Yeah, Rummelt. Yeah.
So I'm really enjoying that. I'm about 2/3 into it, and I think that one's good. And Seven Powers. Seven Powers is also a really good one. Can't remember that author name either, but I'm sure we can find it for the show notes.
We'll have it in the show notes.
Yeah, Seven Powers is it's a terrible title. Well, I mean, it's not terrible. It's sort of like, it's a little bit, excuse my language, dick waving, but the knowledge behind is so good and so actionable and so useful. So I guess those are some of my recommendations for strategy.
Totally agree, especially if you leading a marketplace. In the Seven Powers, one of the powers is network effects, and he talks about that extensively and in a very practical way, for sure. Amazing. Christina, this was fantastic. I have one last question or topic to dig into, not related with OKRs, but you as a writer, because I think you are such a great writer, and you've written 5 books, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to ask 5, right? Yeah. I want to ask. It's amazing. It's really, really good, and of course, needless to say, most of them are really, really popular books. So for those aspiring writers, or for people who are writing right now, or even thinking about writing a book, or even thinking about writing some articles, what are some advice you would have, some general advice on things they should think about and reflect on to become a better writer?
I think you should write. Writers are people who write. So don't think about writing, write things and put them out and publish them. Don't spend a ton of time trying to figure out, is it a blog, is it Medium, whatever, grab whatever suits you and just go for it. Start writing things. One of the things I learned from being on Medium a lot, because they have analytics, which is something I appreciate, is that if you write something and it's not very good, nobody finds it. If you write something that's great, it gets found. So don't worry if you're not good enough. You're always good enough to put something into the world. And the other thing you have to do is read what you write. This is the single most useful thing to do. When you write something, go back, read it a week later, a day later, a year later, but reread what you've written and ask yourself, how would I change it? What could be better? I think paying an editor, if you're going to write a book or anything, paying a development editor. People don't realize there's lots of different kinds of editor. When they think of editors, they think, oh, they're going to look at my grammar or my punctuation. There's this thing called a development editor, and they help you make sure you're making sense. They're the most valuable editor of all. So I love my development editor. I wouldn't write a book without her. So I think that's important. I think if you're talking about books, I'm a big fan of self-publishing. I made a small company to self-publish books because if you work with a publisher, you get 8 to 12% of the profit, and you do 95% of the work. And if you think the publisher is going to market for you, they're not going to market it for you unless you're already famous. So I don't feel like publishers are giving a lot of value and they take a lot of money. But if you self-publish, suck it up. Hire yourself a development editor, hire yourself a line editor, hire yourself a copy editor, a proofreader. Work with, you can do beta testing with your book, which I also highly recommend. You can hire your own cover designer. Like if you're a product person like me, this is just life, right? This is just what we do. We figure out who's going to do it and put it all together and get it out. Because the book is a representation of you, and it would be horrible. I would feel horrible to be embarrassed by a bad book. So I'm very, very fussy about how I do it.
Absolutely.
So, but number one thing is write and reread what you write. Journal. If you're embarrassed to do it in public, just keep a journal every single day. And at the end of the week, read through your journal entries. I think that's always the answer. And ChatGPT still sucks. I can't convince it to sound like I'm like, suppose I can train it to sound like me. Nope, not yet.
Very good. Christina, thank you so much for joining me. I really, really appreciate this conversation.
Oh, it was a blast. It was a super fun conversation. Thank you.
All right, that was it for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Make sure you subscribe to my newsletter so you don't miss out, and see you next time.